on case studies and the practical ways of helping the local community.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to everybody, Excellencies, fellow ambassadors that are here today with me. Ladies and gentlemen, Pansy Maslan, thank you so much for inviting me. I don't know if you were here. Dr. Tenku, thank you so much for encouraging my participation in this event. So, yes, the story is long, but I'm going to try to make it short. No? I was a biologist doing my undergraduate work back in 1996 in a small island in the Colombian Caribbean called San Andres. And I was out there counting basically birds, an endemic bird species that is called the Pireo de San Andres. So I had to just walk around the bush during the mornings, you know, and try to find how many birds were in the different habitats in the island. One of those mornings that I was there, I crossed my path with a native Afro-descendant, what we call a Raizal in Colombia, who is like the typical inhabitant of those islands. And he looked at me, and of course I was a biologist, you know, with a hat, binoculars, a notebook, in the middle of the bush, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" You know? My first reaction was like, "No, I'm here counting birds. There's this bird that is an endemic species that it only lives in this tiny island, and I'm trying to understand how many birds are in the island." And he would ask me like, "What for? What are you doing that for?" And it's like, "No, because it's an endangered species, and we need to know, you know, the population dynamics. You know, you start getting into your fancy vocabulary." And he says, "Yeah, no, I understand that you're doing that, but what are you really doing that for?" It's like, "No, because we want to protect the bird before it goes extinct." And he again told me, but what for?" It's like, "Well, the bird also has trying to find some answers for him, no? It has like a role in the ecosystem. It hunts bugs, it disperses seeds." And it's like, "Yeah, but now we have pesticides, so we can also get rid of the bugs, and we can go buy seeds at the shop and just plant them here." So I was beginning to like understand that conservation was not making any sense for this person. No. However, I just told him that, you know, his practices of slash and burn were affecting the populations. And he turned to me and he told me, he's like, "This might be easy for you to say because you're probably funded here by somebody to be here doing your research, or your parents gave you money to go to the university, so you don't need to worry about your livelihood. But I do need to worry about my livelihood. That's why I do slash and burn every day." And this guy who was Edison, he later became a good friend of mine. Now, I couldn't really find a way for him to understand that conservation was beneficial. And at the same time, I knew he knew what he was doing. He also pointed me out, you know, to, for example, nests of stingless bees and how to harvest the honey from those nests. And they have a high medicinal power, you know, the stingless bees honey. He also knew, for example, how to catch black crabs in the middle of the forest, which is a crab that lives on the higher grounds of the island. And those were things that I didn't know anything about. But regardless he had that knowledge, he still had to go slash and burn the different habitats. So that, of course, began sounding in my mind, like, I'm here counting birds, and these people's necessities have not been actually addressed. So he does not have an alternative, even though he knows a lot of things. No, he even has his own native language, which is Creole English from the islands. Very interesting language. So I decided there to give it a turn after I finished my research, to give it a turn and to try to find the ways to work with people in those communities based on their knowledge, and how can that knowledge and how can their customs be used for conservation instead of my own particular point of view. So engaging with those people led me to my work for many years in communities around the tropics, not only Latin America, but also Africa and Asia. So just to give you a little bit of context of what this really means for us that are conservationists and that are in the tropical biological sciences. As you were mentioning, the Amazon, for example, the largest rainforest, has over 500 different languages spoken by different tribes all around the Amazon. That people also manage 180 million hectares, 6 times the size of Malaysia, and it's only 3.5 to 4 million people. So these people really have the key to one of the huge lungs of the world, as it happens here in Borneo. No? So working in that knowledge became something very important for me. Just a quick example, malaria, for example. Almost 700,000 people die from malaria every year. But the first cure for malaria came by observations of the Quechua Indians in Peru and Bolivia, who discovered that the bark of a cinchona tree will lower the fevers that they will get when they were bitten by the mosquitoes. And that was almost 300 years ago that the Jesuits wrote down those observations that the local people were doing. So just a couple of examples before I get the bell on how this local knowledge is used. So my work centered a lot on non-timber forest products as an umbrella to try to conserve the areas. But the management of those non-timber forest products without the local knowledge is impossible. Suriname, one of the places that I had the chance to work, a community of what the Guayana communities, have this Guayana language also. They make a livelihood from Brazil nuts. Many of you have for sure have eaten Brazil nuts, with your trail mix when you go walking in the forest. Hopefully you walk a lot in the forest. And one of the reasons that we wanted to work with them and the Brazil nuts was because there was a market for them. And we thought, or the assumption was, that if they had a good livelihood through a non-timber forest product, they would protect the forest. Suriname is the country in the world with most forest. Almost 84 to 86% of the country is completely forest nowadays. So before deforestation got there, we knew that the community needed needed a livelihood to work in the forest. So we created a small enterprise in the middle of the jungle, and one of the first things that we did was ask them, does the Brazil nut is being produced? No? So in our terms, how does the sustainable or the value chain works? From our own point of view, we would see like somebody collects the nuts, dries the nuts, packs the nuts, and sells them. No? But when we were and validated our first impression of how that was working, they say, no, Alejandro, the first thing that you need to know is that there's certain butterflies that are the pollinators of those trees. So if those butterflies start being absent from the area, the Brazil nut is not going to happen. The second very important thing is the little agoutis, which is a rodent from the jungle, are also the seed dispersers of the Brazil nut. So the agoutis needed to be part of the management plan of the sustainable value chain. And they were the people there that told us, you need to understand that those nuts are going to be buried by the seed dispersers, and that's the only way to regenerate the forest. Things that we didn't know. So that's part of the ecological result of that, or the results of that knowledge result in some ecological management also around the forest. That is one example. I have 1 minute for another example. Another non-timber forest product that we were working with was the tonka tree. It's also in the Amazon rainforest. Givaudan, which is a huge enterprise, a huge firm in France that is dedicated to flavors and fragrances, uses the tonka in their fine perfumes. And they would buy tonka beans from the Amazon in Venezuela, from certain communities of Piaroa communities in the middle of the Amazonian rainforest. So our idea was to try to help through a market access to directly from those communities so that they can have certain funds or a flow of funds so they could conserve the forest. But Givaudan at the same time wanted evidence to see that the forest was being taken care of and that the species were there. We couldn't send a biologist to live there, and nowadays less and less biologists are willing to go live in the middle of the forest, so the community started doing the monitoring with their own knowledge of the forest. Where can you find the tracks of the jaguar? Where will you find the different parrots that are also indicator species of the forest? And they became the guardians of this forest. Well, they were already the guardians, but they were producing enough data for Givaudan for them to justify that they could invest in those communities in the middle of the forest. Those two examples, now I have many more, but those two examples resulted not only in conservation, but in the protection of the knowledge. Why? Because knowledge that you don't use, it gets lost. The best way to protecting knowledge, at least as I see it, is that you have to use it. No? As you have to speak the language so it doesn't get lost. If you use the language, if you use the knowledge, it remains. So that is also being part of the work that connects preserving nature, preserving the cultural ways of the people, and preserving their knowledge.